Biotech Investing webinar hosted by Horizon 3 Biotech Fund and sponsored and conducted by FB Rice and Monsoon Communications. As some invitees were unable to attend today, we have been asked to record this webinar, so please be aware this webinar is being recorded. And before we begin, the disclaimer. The purpose of this presentation is not to give financial product advice. If any financial product advice is given in the presentation, standard disclaimers, that it is general advice only, apply. That is, it has been prepared without taking into account any person's objectives, financial situation or needs, and therefore you should consider the appropriateness of the advice in light of situation and requirements. Now, we are very fortunate to have two panellists experienced in ASX-listed biotechs today, David Blake and Chris Behrenbrook, who will be providing some of their insights into the ASX biotech market and different strategies to penetrate major medical product markets, also risks of clinical trials and how they can be mitigated. And then they'll be answering your questions. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen anytime from now, and we will address as many of these as possible after we hear from the panellists. But first we'll do Matt on Horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. Yesterday, some of you would have seen the Pfizer and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, BioNTech or BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine initiative reported 90% efficacy. However, this is an early read of the first group of patients. It's not all patients. And says nothing about long-term immunity yet, because I'm not sure what the read is. It's probably about a month into it. However, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who I think we all know, US leading infectious disease expert, commented the results were extraordinary and that the Pfizer news bodes well for Moderna, saying that Moderna will likely have similar results. I don't know enough about this, but I'm guessing they're similar technologies. Also, Telix says it has an up to US $315 million plus royalties, 10-year development and commercialization partnership with China Grand Pharmaceutical and Healthcare for its prostate, renal and brain cancer imaging and therapeutic molecularly targeted radiation products in Greater China. And we'll hear more from the Telix CEO very soon. And in fact, Chris, there was a pre-question, so a question with notice was submitted, which I suspect you will be answering anyway. It says, I am interested in hearing Telix's China Grand Pharma deal and other Asian market prospects. So I suspect you'll be covering that already. Sanofi has struck a deal to buy Kiadis for 308 million euro. The takeover will give Sanofi full control of an off-the-shelf natural killer cell platform it is already using to try to enhance its multiple myeloma drug. Some of you might have seen Antisense is applying for dual listing on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. I know that's got to do with a reasonable shareholding in Europe and targeting that market. Imugene has received US FDA IND approval to initiate a phase 1 clinical trial for its checkpoint immunotherapy candidate, PD-1 Vax in the US. And finally, Pharmaxis. The FDA recently approved Bronchitol for adult cystic fibrosis sufferers, triggering a US $10 million milestone. Now, we turn to our panel members, David and Chris. You have both had a lot of experience and knowledge in the biotech sector. For the benefit of the audience, would you mind imparting some of your perspectives on the following questions? Can I start with you, Chris? As flagged earlier, Telix Pharmaceutical has signed a significant deal with China Grand. Tell us about that deal and what it means for Telix going forward. In addition, could you comment on the strategy deployed to penetrate such a major medical market?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, look, the way I see it, when you're a small biotech company, you've got sort of one of two possible game plans, right? One is you develop your asset or a couple of assets if you're lucky. You develop them to a point where somebody else comes along and takes you out. and the impetus and the need to do regional geographic deals is probably not there, and it may not even be desirable. It may be that if you really want to do the best possible deal for your asset, you want to make a global transaction possible. Our company is a little different. It sort of tends to veer towards a second strategy, which is because our pipeline is very late stage and we have a lot of assets in our pipeline. Our goal is to monetize, to become a revenue generating business, and to have partnerships in all of the major territories in which we do business. So, in the last 12 months, Telix has delivered clinical product, either as an investigational or a special access or compassionate use or in a clinical trial. We've delivered product to 50 or 60 countries, and that sort of reflects our strategy, which is we want to build a market for our products in all of the major markets. And I think in 2020, notwithstanding a lot of geopolitical tension with China, I think it does need to be acknowledged that China is an incredibly important market. It's not only an important market from a healthcare and just serving a populace from a disease or an indication perspective, but it's an important innovation environment. Chinese pharmaceutical companies are starting to strut the world stage. They're starting to develop intellectual property and deals with global pharmaceutical companies that I think are enviable. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has become, in my opinion, probably the second most important life sciences hub after NASDAQ. And so, to not be active in that region is remiss. And I think Australian companies have a natural advantage. I think, it is our backyard. Obviously, we can't travel there at the moment, and I won't lie to you, it's hard to do a deal in a pandemic, but there's a long history there and collegial relationships that kind of allow you to extend into a Zoom call and get a deal done. But I think it's really important that Australian companies don't just look at the US or Europe, which is it's the natural tendency to do, but I think that Asia is really important as well. And so we're absolutely delighted. It's very difficult to go into a market like China solo. You basically can't. Same applies to Japan, Korea to some extent. So you got to have a partner. I think we've chosen an excellent partner with a good track record in our space, and so yeah, it's an exciting development for the company. And I think we can now demonstrate to our shareholders that we've got a game plan really we're very active in America and Canada. We've got a growing presence in Latin America. We're active in Europe and Middle East, and now China, Japan, and so it does start to present a comprehensive strategy for what's rapidly becoming a fairly global business.
So Chris, Telix has also had a win at the FDA recently. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, look, we have a lot of things going with the FDA, and try not to carry. I often get criticized by shareholders that our ASX disclosures are pretty dour when they come to regulator-related disclosures. That's because really, unless the FDA or EMA is letting you run a trial or approving a product, there really isn't much to grandstand about, in my opinion. But we've had breakthrough designation applied to our renal cancer program. We have a couple of orphan programs which are really exciting and starting to generate some exciting data. This month is a big month for the company. On the US time, on the 23rd of November, we have the outcome of whether the FDA will accept our new drug application. I'm hoping it'll be a little faster than Bronchitol, but that's where we're at right now. 24th, we have our final pre-phase 3 meeting, hopefully our final pre-phase 3 meeting with the FDA for our prostate therapy program. So yeah, it's a really big month as far as dealing with the FDA goes. But look, I think no one should ever claim to predict or understand how the FDA really operates and thinks, except I think with respect to one matter, which is, and it's something that I think Australian companies, don't do very often, is, you have to engage early and often with the FDA. And a lot of companies kind of leave the regulatory stuff to the end rather than seeing it as, a pathway. It's part of the journey of clinical development, and really to periodically and regularly engage with the FDA and get their input on things. My view, notwithstanding some of the political commentary around the FDA, which I prefer to avoid, but my view and my experience of dealing with the FDA is that it's staffed by women and men that are, scientists and high caliber scientists typically. They have a high commitment, a personal commitment to human health. They'll generally follow the data. They'll generally listen to the scientific argument. And if you've got a good scientific argument or a patient-centric argument that is rational, I think that there's a lot of maneuver room with the FDA. But that maneuver doesn't come if they've never heard of you and you don't have a relationship with them. So that engagement, that constant engagement is pretty important. And you can imagine, Telix has, I guess we have now 7 programs that are under the jurisdiction of the FDA. That means constant, we're probably in touch with them, every other week about something. And so that means you've got to really have, a consistent behavior and professional behavior, and understand that, you'll be looked at and evaluated as a company, not just as a product.
Is it hard to get their attention sometimes? Like you want constant dialogue, but do they want you to make appointments?
I believe that they do. I believe that the FDA wants that engagement. Not frivolously and vexatiously, but genuinely speaking, the mechanisms are there for companies to engage and to seek advice. I think that's true of all regulators. Some regulators, it's easier. It's expensive to deal with the FDA, not because the FDA is charging you fees, because they're generally not until you get to the very end, but it's expensive in terms of the standard of preparation that's required. And if you're a foreign company, that means, the cost typically, we self-publish now our own materials, but, it does mean using, various agents to get stuff in front of the FDA. And it can get pricey if you're always asking the FDA questions. Obviously, closer to home, the TGA charges you for consultations, which is a little bit of a barrier for some companies if they don't have much cash. But, I would say, in general, the regulators are there to scientifically engage. Their whole mission is to support product development safely moving ahead into human health. And there's as much curiosity and interest in doing that on their side as there is on our side. I really believe that.
Okay, thanks for that. That's great. Now, David, having reported on the ASX biotech market through BioShares now for approximately 15 years, you've seen it all.
A bit longer, 20.
Oh, well done. Okay, maybe I'm showing my age, but similar to Chris's question, what strategies have you seen employed or not employed when companies you report on try to penetrate major medical product markets?
I guess this question is an opportunity to talk about one company in particular, which is Nanosonics, and that's really a textbook for investors to look at when it comes to instrument or device manufacturers who might have the ability to themselves go into international markets, especially the US. For drug developers, it's a different kettle of fish. It usually is best to license a molecule or a biologic to a large company because the heavy lifting is enormous. But sometimes an Australian company can organise itself to go into major markets. And although historically Australian companies and in fact, around the world, small companies going into large markets have opted to take on distributors. But that comes at an incredible price because you lose the connection with the customer. You don't capture often really important data about how your product might be used. Sure, you don't have that capital cost of supporting a sales force, but at the same time, you don't have people in those other businesses incentivized in the way that employees of an Australian firm might be through their natural loyalty to the company, as well as incentives that might come their way through shares. So Nanosonics was had done a distribution deal with GE Healthcare, and you would have thought, what could go wrong? But you know, Ron Weinberger at the time said, these people do not know how to sell this product, and they were spending all their time training and teaching GE sales staff to sell Trophon, the infection control system that goes into clinics where probes are used by physicians. So they decided that they would take back that distribution arrangement, turn GE, if you like, into a reseller. And they have gone, since they did that in 2015, they raised some money to support that expansion, 25 million at the time. It seems nothing today. And this is a $1.7 billion company, folks. It's been tremendously successful and justifiably successful too. But the real thinking you have to look at here, and this relates to where small companies in Australia get it wrong, is that Nanosonics just didn't say, well, we'll go sell a product directly to customers. They actually have a mix of revenue models. They still use some distributors, but they also have lease arrangements for customers to take their equipment. They have gone around the world to find different ways to optimize a transaction or the revenue flow that can come from an instrument. So the real novelty is to do with the way in which they've exploited or deployed a mixed revenue model for Trophon, which also, by the way, isn't just a capital equipment item. It comes with canisters for the chemical that is used in the machine. So one other thing that Nanosonics have is that they've got a very, very good CEO who might be most like, more like Brian McNamee as one of the great strategists than I've never met anywhere else, really. So getting somebody good in the driver's seat is also important. So you want to have somebody who can set strategy, drive strategy, and then below that, the people to implement the strategy. And that's another really important thing for Australian medical product developers who might be thinking that they want to have much more control over their business. But there's another company out there that's been very successful, and it has been able to take its drug product into international markets, and that's Clinuvel Pharmaceuticals. This is an exceptional story, but partly the reason it's been successful is it's been focused on developing and commercializing a drug, and now looking to other indications, but in what are called orphan drug indications. So because of that company's focus on very, very, very small numbers of patients in a disease category, they have had the option to actually have a fully integrated approach, meaning manufacture. They've done their clinical trials in-house. They've never used, as far as I know, a contract clinical research group. That can be a terrible source of risk for biotech companies when you go to somebody else and you say, please get us these patients, and it turns out that CRO can't, which is a bit disappointing when you blow up your budget because they failed you. So that company, Clinuvel, has started out with a particular understanding of a disease and the if you like, the economics of that patient group, which has determined then its plan to go and deliver pretty significant returns to investors. It might be the only drug developer of, if you like, a therapeutic product that I know of that's come out of the small cap ranks in Australia to pay dividends. It's just, sometimes you keep lists when you see 3 or 4 or 5 events take place, but if it's one, you don't keep the list, and it's a peculiarity in that way.
Thanks, David. David, risk in biotech is typically off the scale compared to most other sectors. For the layperson, clinical trials are a binary outcome. You either hit your primary endpoint or you don't, sink or swim, so to speak. However, it's not necessarily as simple as that. How have you seen companies handle the risks of clinical trials well?
Oh, look, they
Both
mostly
locally
have.
and internationally, and how did they mitigate this risk?
Well, look, it's a good question. What should a company do that, if you like, is best practice? And we've actually had, as it turns out, really not that many examples of companies that, if you like, have gone through phase 2 through to and past phase 2 studies of Australian drug developers or therapeutic product developers. Really not that many, and only of those, only a few have ever really come home with the bacon. But if I was to think about what they do that's important, they will pay attention to the difference between looking at drug effect along with what should be clinically meaningful. So you can get, in some ways, it's pretty easy to get a biological signal of a drug or a device, or of an intervention. That's fine, and then you can test that against a comparator, and you might find some difference. And that's an effect, but it's also got to relate to what happens in the level of the clinic. So what is it matters to physicians, what matters to patients. So it could be, for example, take Invex Therapeutics, who recently completed a phase 2 study of their repurposed diabetes drug exenatide, and they were able to show both a effect on intracranial hypertension, which was clinically meaningful, and then also an effect on headache days, which was clinically meaningful. That's important. Something else that companies do is that I can't verify this, but Chris might be able to comment, is that I think that they get very good advice. For example, statistical advice. They don't pretend they know about things that aren't in their field of expertise, so they'll go and shop around and get good quality advice. They get good quality investigators and collaborators. That's a big deal. When it comes to clinical studies, they pay attention to selecting patients so that, they get their inclusion criteria right, they get their exclusion criteria right. They also pay attention to the pool of recruitable patients. And that pool is affected by competitors, and they might come from the large companies or numerous other small companies. So that's really important, because if you can't recruit patients into a trial, no matter how good your drug or your intervention is, you might never complete it in a reasonable time frame, and you can destroy shareholders' money and funds in a flash by stuffing that up. Seems logical and basic, but the world doesn't always work that way. Something else they do is they might, for example, evaluate a mix of hard and soft endpoints, meaning harder, a good, very, very testable biomarker endpoint, but along they'll look at functional outcomes as well. And you should see a benefit through those two avenues. Chris might want to comment about that as well. So I think that's important. They also don't dismiss the importance of safety and side of therapeutic product development as they progress from phase 2 to phase 3. Safety is always important, and safety is something that is actually connects to decisions that are made very early on in the entire process. You neglect one thing in your early stages of manufacturing, and that could kill you in phase 3. And if you don't check the boxes on safety all the time, you're wasting everybody's time when you go to a meeting with a regulator, because they'll say, well, there's this issue here. And to trivialize or to downplay safety is something that you don't want to hear a therapeutic product developer doing. Something else I think that good developers think about is they don't ever rush a clinical program, even though at the same time they'll have the highest sense of urgency to complete that. So they will do their analysis, and if it turns out that a study will take 2 years to enroll and 3 years to complete, well, that's what it's going to be, and they won't necessarily say, oh, well, let's peek in and have a look, and let's try and get a good figure sooner so we can reduce the share price. And the Australian biotech sector is full of juicing activity pretty much on a daily and weekly basis, and it's been quite the activity this year, where people have been turning their heads to investing in this sector. So urgency matters, but rushing to get a readout is not necessarily what you want to see. The flip side is you can see companies that have not met their targeted milestone, and there's a delay of a month or 2 months or 3 months before you get a result, and you think, well, if they're delaying coming out with the announcement, it's going to be not good. So there's a few things about, if you like, better practice, maybe not best practice.
Yeah. So Chris, there's a lot there, and you're in the best position here to supplement or refute what David said. I think you're still on mute. Still on mute, I think. Oh, can FB Rice take him off mute? Thank you.
There you go. Thank you. Sorry, I put myself on mute because I've got hay fever and I'm sniffling away, and I didn't want people to think that I was scoffing at David's remarks as he was making them. But no, look. Basically, I think what David has said is broadly right. I think there's, 3 sort of comments maybe that spring to mind. I think the first one is on trial design. Really, companies have to get to a point where the trial is about what a payer is going to be looking for, not just demonstrating some sort of biological signal. As David said, it's actually pretty straightforward to coin a trial that shows something or does something. And there are, unfortunately, in our sector, and I've commented on them a good deal in my past life. There are a lot of companies that I think deliberately run trials to evade the question of really what is the level of evidence that's going to be necessary to get not just an approval, but to get a product adopted as standard of care. And I certainly had that experience with Factor Therapeutics. We ran a very a trial that's been heralded really as a world-class, first of its kind, sort of gold standard trial. And it wasn't intended to show drug efficacy per se. It was intended to determine if the drug had better performance than standard of care. So it's a subtle question, but it's a question to this day, I would say, that unfortunately, and it's a reflection of the management team's communication success or lack thereof. I'd say being self-critical, lack thereof. There are still today, I would say 80% of shareholders still don't understand that. It wasn't about showing if the drug worked. It was about if the drug worked better than what was already out in the market. And we did that because the indication that we were going after was such an enormous indication, but it would need to have insurers saying, yes, I will switch from bandages and dressings and the type of typical wound care management to a very pricey biologic drug in a very large patient population indication. So that's it. So it's not just about showing something happening, it's about showing something happening relative to the best practice of medicine. And that's really tough. That actually is, it doesn't matter what disease area it is, that is the hard thing to show. It doesn't matter whether it's a repurposed diabetes drug, a wound care drug, an oncology drug, you have to show that you're better, not just that something is going on. So I think that's my first comment. My second comment is it's not just about safety. I think David's right. Safety is something that goes all the way through. In fact, it goes even when you're out in the market. Safety remains an ongoing pharmacovigilance is an ongoing part of delivering a product to market, but it's not just about safety, it's about risk benefit. And I think that a lot of the times, particularly on the ASX, that risk benefit profile is not well understood. There's no point in having a therapy that has a mild benefit if you're going to be delivering it to tens or hundreds of thousands of people. Like, that's, you have to have a therapeutic index to your product. And so not just knowing whether your drug is potent or not, but whether the whole spectrum of side effects and issues around drug deployment are really tenable from a commercial perspective is something that needs to be understood. And that is typically not a company-driven decision. That's typically driven by the clinicians and the people that are ultimately going to use the product. And so if you're not out talking to key opinion leaders, and if you don't, as David exactly said, if you don't have the right advisory that's really at the forefront of your field, probably going to make the wrong decisions. It's probably just a story, not really a drug development, exercise. And then the third one, that David mentioned, which I think is also a fairly, it's a fairly good point, is it really comes down to the manufacturing and the CMC and the way in which you produce the drug. There are, you do need to think as phase development, that you do things that are appropriate for that level of phase. We're always trying to balance getting a signal, getting an outcome versus the investment level that's required. And ideally, you want to tick the safety box as quickly or preliminarily as quickly as you possibly can and move into some sort of an efficacy seeking signal and utilize your shareholder capital in the most effective way. But there does come a point where you just simply have to invest. Making a drug ready for a phase 3 trial is immensely difficult because really whatever test article you use in a phase 3 trial is probably going to be the test article that you're going to include in your regulatory submission for a product approval. And that is one of the big challenges of drug development, and it's a big challenge for underfunded life sciences companies because you got to write some fairly big checks in advance of that pivotal data. And so you've got to maintain, integrity and confidence from your investors in the lead up to that, because they're going to write a check and not necessarily see an outcome for a fairly long period of time. And that's one of the challenges for sure.
Thanks, guys. We've actually had a question come through, sort of a nice segue from Thomas. Does the good advice sought by good biotechs that David mentioned extend to business development and investor distribution networks? A quick response to that.
Don't really understand the question. Can you?
Well, I think we've been talking about regulatory advice. We're talking about clinical trials advice. Does it extend to business development advisors and and also commercialization distribution networks?
Definitely. David, you seem fired up to answer that one.
I would imagine that would apply. I mean, all investment bankers, for example, are not created equally, and they're not all as expert and talented as each other. So, finding there is so much of the world of medical product development which requires, if you like, the small company to access specialists for advice for many, many different things. I mean, you need to, if you're developing a drug, you've got to get toxicology studies done, and there are suppliers and vendors around the world, and it goes through, I'd imagine, to people who can supply commercial advice about commercial strategy. Now, probably the thing is that in that area, we've seen many people offer their services, say from the US to Australian companies, and they've turned out to be shonks. And it's been a bugbear, I guess, for Australian investors to watch companies get dudded time and time and time again. And only over a long period of time do companies, I think, or the sector, if you like, in Australia, has it learned in a collective sense, the difference between high quality, medium quality, low quality for vendors, as well as actually bringing in some of those skills and knowledge themselves into their companies. So, I mean, look at Chris. Chris has got a lot of experience just accumulated over time. And, you would think, well, what's this guy who worked with Factor Therapeutics doing at Telex? Well, actually, he's bringing everything he learnt at Telex plus elsewhere into this business. And that's a really, really important thing, to see people just move on, but learn and then apply those lessons to their next endeavors. So while there's a lot of green looks and rookie looks around in the sector, there's segments of it where you can see have some hope that things will be done better and risks will be mitigated, and so that rewards can be maybe hopefully gained.
Thanks, guys.
I agree. I mean, just to comment, I think that the sector is maturing. I think it is getting better, and I think that on the technical advisory side, it's getting better. But also, I think on the financial advisory side, I think it's also improving. I mean, we still have two very distinct markets. I think we have a growing institutional shareholder advisor base here that's pretty sophisticated about life sciences, has pretty good advisory around it. There are some decent analysts on both the sell side and the buy side that I think are starting to get up to the level of their peers in the US or in Europe. But the other thing that we have to remember is, and it took me a lot of years, when I first came back to Australia, because I left in '97, go overseas and do a PhD, and then it was supposed to be 3 years, and it ended up being like 20 years. When I came back and understood what was happening on the ASX with small cap life sciences companies, I was horrified. And it took me about 3 or 4 years to understand that it's a substitute for venture capital. And whilst investing is made on the basis of advice and insight and experience or whatever, there is also an asset management component to it, which is based on pricing risk and pricing performance. And one of the things that's interesting about being a public company, and my personal opinion is that there's really no good reason for a biotech company to be privately held. The investment horizons are so long, and to maximize the return of the entity, you need to be able to allow shareholder turnover. There's a guy called Oleg Nodelman, who was a founder of EcoR1, which is a San Francisco-based life sciences investor. He once said at an investor forum that I attended in Silicon Valley, biotech should always be public. Energy companies should always be public because the time horizons are such a long investment. And I've sort of come to agree with that. What's neat about being a public company is that if you perform and the markets are not completely out of kilter, and of course that's the problem with being a public company. I mean, this last 12 months, for example, has been an insane ride being a public company. I mean, whether you're a good company, bad company, it's been a remarkable 12 months with so many unpredictable facets to it. But the general feeling, I think, is that if you do perform and you do hit your deliverables and you do hit your endpoints and you do drive your share price as a function of performance, that your ability to raise capital at a better price is there. The potential is there. That is not always the case in the private space. And it depends a lot more on the dynamics of your individual shareholders. And so I do think that Australian buy side and sell side is starting to get a grasp on biotech, starting to get an appetite for it. But then for those companies that miss their goals or don't deliver, or for whatever purpose choose to endure, there are asset managers that will just price risk. And that's an important part of providing liquidity and capital to the sector. I don't personally like it all that much, and I wish it had a higher homogeneous level of quality, because I think that would drive more momentum. But I personally believe that the quality is improving, and that's what I personally think.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but then you've gone part way to answering this question, and so I wonder if you just add another 20 seconds to it. The question said from Michael, can you talk to managing the strategic timeline of developing a drug device versus the investor timeline requirements?
Yeah, look, I think there's still a long ways to go there. You know, if I'm being, you know, candid, it's very hard. Being a biotech company, you have a goal that you're going to finish something by the end of that quarter or the end of that month. And if there's any sector that allows that where delays are going to inevitably appear, you know, no matter how much padding you put into your timelines, there's still going to be a problem, a delay, or, you know, a pandemic, or, you know, I mean, there's just stuff that happens that delays the ability to hit those milestones. And I think the hard lesson that I've learned, and I'm sure Michael has, and other ASX CEOs, is that you know, if you say you're going to get something done at the end of a quarter, you know, by the end of the quarter in one day, you're on the hook to deliver that.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, it's not an easy thing to do, and execution is everything. And by the way, I don't claim, I get a lot of criticism from shareholders and stockbrokers that sometimes my horizon lines are a bit, you know, a bit rose tinted and a bit ambitious. But I think it is a really hard thing to achieve, and that's the problem. And then that leads, that tolerance for flexibility and understanding that, well, okay, they're a quarter behind, but that's pretty good for biotech. That understanding doesn't exist. And I'm not necessarily sure it has to exist, but it would be obviously a lot easier if it did. But yeah, you know, what you see then is an immediate loss of interest. Oh, they haven't hit their milestone.
Yeah.
You know, the share price starts to slowly but surely, you know, week after week, just slide down. And then that tends to then drive and exacerbate the behavior where I've got to find ways to put news flow out there and pump up my share price and, you know, sneak a peek at a clinical trial or whatever. That's when the sort of scrappy behavior starts to happen, because, you know, companies are always trying to recover to enable the possibility of that future capital raise if they need to have it, right? That's, you know, that's the innate challenge of it. So getting the milestone and getting the articulation of the inflection points for the business accurate is I don't claim to be good at. In fact, I'm probably not good at it, if I'm really honest with you, but I think it's the biggest challenge that a public company CEO has, for sure.
So I'll summarize that by saying, don't march to the beat of a few bucks from a few shareholders.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Look, we're going to have to wind it up now because we've actually gone over time. Next webinar is on the 24th of November, in a fortnight. Thank you to the audience for feedback. If you have any further, email me at matt@horizon3biotech.com. Thanks to FB Rice and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting the webinar. And finally, thank you to both our panelists, Chris and David. See you all at the same time in a fortnight. Stay safe. And Melburnians, enjoy the freedom. Thanks,
yeah, right.
guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers, David. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much.